The little girl grabbed the stranger's hand in the busy hospital lobby, her voice barely a whisper. "Please don't go. You smell like my real dad." James Carter froze. He had never met this child. Across the corridor, CEO Charlotte Sinclair moved toward him with the cold precision of someone accustomed to removing obstacles. "Security," she said. "Get him out." But the girl only held tighter, pressing her face against his leg and crying as though she was terrified of losing the only safe thing left. And then a single small detail shifted everything. James Carter was the kind of man who occupied space without demanding attention. At 33, he moved through the world with a quiet efficiency that most people mistook for indifference, a habit built over years of learning that the loudest person in the room was rarely the most useful one. That Tuesday morning he had arrived at Meridian Private Hospital before 7. His tools loaded, and his work order printed and folded in his breast pocket. The job was routine. A ventilation unit on the 4th floor, the VIP wing, had been cycling improperly for 2 days. The facilities manager had flagged it low priority, but low priority work had a way of compounding into expensive emergencies, and James Carter had never been the kind of person who let things compound. He signed in at the service entrance and took the staff elevator. No one looked up. That was how it usually went. Maintenance technicians occupied a particular layer of institutional invisibility, present enough to keep things running, absent enough that no one felt the need to acknowledge them. James had long since stopped minding. There was something useful about being unseen. You noticed more when no one was watching you back. He was good at his job. More than good, though he would never have said so. He understood complex systems the way some men understood music intuitively, structurally, as a series of causes and effects that could be traced if you were patient enough to follow them. He had studied mechanical engineering in another life, a fact he kept to himself. The degree had been earned, used briefly, and then set aside after the kind of personal catastrophe that doesn't leave room for ambition. His wife, Rachel, had died in the delivery room 4 years ago. The baby, a girl they had already named Lily, had survived. Rachel had not. James had walked out of that hospital carrying his daughter in a yellow blanket and had never spoken about that night with anything approaching ease. He had sold the apartment, moved to a quieter neighborhood, and built a life that was smaller and slower but solid in the way that only things built by grief tend to be. He raised Lily alone. He read to her every night. He learned to braid hair by watching the same instructional recording 37 times until he got it right. He packed her lunch with the same precision he applied to everything else, and when she cried he held her without flinching, because he understood by then that the point was not to make the pain stop, but to make sure no one faced it alone. That morning, climbing the stairs to the 4th floor with his toolbox in hand, he was only thinking about the ventilation unit. He was not thinking about the past. He was not thinking about the strange turn the next hour would take. He had no reason to. The VIP corridor on the 4th floor was quieter than the floors below. Fewer staff, wider hallways. The particular hushed quality of a space maintained to suggest comfort rather than urgency. James had been up here twice before. Both times for the same chronic ventilation issue the facilities team had been patching rather than fixing. He intended to fix it properly this time, which meant pulling the access panel and working from inside the duct, a process that would take the better part of 2 hours. He had just set down his toolbox beside the access panel when he heard running footsteps, light, quick, the unmistakable rhythm of a small child moving at full speed with no particular destination in mind. He straightened and looked up. The girl was perhaps 5 or 6, dark-haired, wearing a pale blue hospital gown slightly too large for her. She had the loose energy of a child who had been cooped up too long in a small room and had found an unguarded moment to escape it. She ran the length of the corridor without looking up, and then she looked up, and she stopped. She stopped so abruptly that she nearly fell forward. James waited. He had learned, with Lily, that children made their own decisions about strangers, and the worst thing an adult could do was accelerate that process. The girl stared at him with the kind of absolute, unself-conscious attention that only children are capable of. Then she crossed the corridor and walked directly toward him, reached up, and wrapped both arms around his waist. He stood very still. "You smell like my real dad," she said against his shirt. Her voice was completely certain. There was nothing questioning in it, no reaching for a memory. It was the voice of a child stating a fact as plainly as she would state that the sky was blue. James looked down at her. He did not pull away. He was not afraid of her, only confused. And underneath the confusion there was something else, a pull he could not immediately name, something old and instinctive, the way the body sometimes responds before the mind has caught up. "Hey," he said quietly. "What's your name?" "Ava," she said, still not letting go. "Ava, where are your nurses?" "I don't know." She tilted her head back to look at him. Her eyes were a clear gray-green, serious and direct, in a way that reminded him of something he couldn't quite place. "You're not going to leave, are you?" He looked down the corridor. Several nurses had stopped. 2 of them were already moving toward him, and one had her hand on her radio. The unguarded moment had apparently ended. "Your mom must be worried," James said. "She's always worried," Ava said simply. And she held on. Charlotte Sinclair arrived in under 2 minutes. James had not yet fully processed what was happening, a child he had never met, holding on to him in a hospital corridor while staff gathered at a cautious distance when he heard the heels. Measured, rapid, the kind of sound that moves through an institutional corridor with authority and purpose. He looked up. She was younger than he expected. Late 20s, perhaps early 30s, impeccably dressed even here, where she had clearly come running from a meeting, a tablet tucked under one arm, her dark blazer slightly displaced by the speed of her arrival. She was not a visitor. Whatever role she occupied in this building, she occupied it completely. Her eyes found her daughter first, then moved to James. The transition happened in under a second, and what came after it was not relief. "Ava." The single word landed with a precision that stopped the surrounding staff in place. Then, without looking away from James, "Security." "Ma'am." "I'm security," she repeated. Then, to the nearest nurse. "Who is this person? How did he access this floor?" James raised his hands slightly, not in surrender, but in the way of a man who understood that explanations needed to be offered carefully. "I'm a maintenance technician. I have a work order for the ventilation unit in this corridor. I can show you my ID and the order number." "I don't care." She was already moving toward her daughter, crouching down, speaking quietly. "Ava, come here." Ava did not move. She had loosened her grip on James's waist but had not released him entirely. She looked at her mother with the particular calm of a child who has already made a decision and is merely waiting for the adults to catch up. "He smells like Daddy," she said. Charlotte Sinclair's face did not change, but something behind her eyes did a microscopic shift, there and gone, like a shadow passing over still water. "Come here," she said again. Ava reached up and took her mother's hand, but with her other hand she kept hold of James's sleeve. And when Charlotte gently tried to move her away, she tightened her grip and began to cry. Not the performance of a child seeking leverage, but the genuine, frightened crying of someone being pulled from something she needed. The security officer had arrived. He looked at James. James met his eyes steadily and said nothing. One of the attending physicians, a gray-haired man who had been watching from the doorway of a nearby room, stepped forward. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. "She doesn't respond that way to strangers. In my clinical experience, this kind of attachment in a child this young is almost always—" "Thank you, Dr. Warren," Charlotte said. Her voice was a door closing. "I didn't ask." They kept James in the security office for 40 minutes. It was a windowless room near the service entrance, furnished with 2 chairs, a table, and the quiet hum of the building's systems in the walls. A security officer sat across from him, reviewing his credentials with the methodical patience of someone who had done this many times. James answered every question without evasion. He had nothing to hide, so he simply told the truth in the same tone he would use to explain a mechanical problem clearly, without embellishment. His work order was verified. His contractor ID matched the hospital's records. His background check, run through the service company's standard protocol, returned nothing. The security officer thanked him and said he was free to go, but asked him to collect his tools and leave the 4th floor for the rest of the day. Another technician would be sent for the ventilation unit. James nodded and went back upstairs to retrieve his toolbox. The corridor was quieter now. The staff had dispersed. At the far end, near the window that looked out over the parking structure, he could see Charlotte Sinclair crouched in front of her daughter, talking to her in a low voice. Ava was listening with the reluctant patience of a child who disagrees but has decided, for now, not to argue. James was almost past them when Ava looked up and saw him. She moved quickly, too quickly for Charlotte to stop her, and crossed the corridor, and caught his arm. "Wait," she said. He stopped. She was looking at his chest, not at his face. At a point just below his collarbone, where the collar of his shirt had fallen open slightly, revealing the cord of a thin leather necklace, Ava reached up slowly, as though reaching for something fragile. Her fingers touched the pendant, a small, worn piece of metal, roughly hexagonal, the finish long since rubbed away from years of handling. It looked like nothing. The kind of object that accumulates meaning entirely through proximity to a life. "He had this," Ava said. Her voice was very quiet. "My dad had this." James looked down at the pendant. He had been wearing it so long that he rarely thought about it anymore. It had come to him during a period he did not examine closely, carried in a jacket pocket for months before he had threaded it onto a cord and worn it like something that needed to stay close. Charlotte was standing behind her daughter now. James looked up and found her watching him with an expression that had, for just a fraction of a second, lost its professional composure. Not much, barely anything really, but it was there a recognition that she was not ready for, pressing against the wall she had built around herself. Then it was gone. "Ava," she said, "that's enough." She guided her daughter back down the corridor without another word. James stood in the empty hallway for a moment, the pendant warm against his palm. He had closed his fingers around it, without noticing. He stood there a long time after they were gone. He did not sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table in the small house he rented near the edge of the district. Lily asleep down the hall. The dishes dried and stacked, the kind of order that makes a house feel like a life being managed, rather than lived. He had poured a glass of water and not drunk it. The window above the sink showed him nothing but dark, and his own faint reflection. He kept going back to the girl's face. Not to the way she had held on to him, though that had been striking enough. Not even to the pendant, though that detail sat in the back of his mind like a splinter he couldn't locate. It was something smaller than either of those things. It was the absolute calm in her eyes when she first looked up at him. The absence of any searching. She hadn't been trying to remember something. She already knew. He had seen that expression before. On Lily, once, when she had been very small and sick and frightened, and James had come into the room in the dark. She had looked at him that way, not with recognition in the usual sense, but with something older and more fundamental. The way a body orients toward warmth, the way a hand closes around something familiar even in a dream. Children that age did not construct narratives. They responded to something real. Or they didn't respond at all. He had paid enough attention to his own daughter to understand that the certainty he had seen in Ava Bennett was not the product of confusion or fantasy. She was remembering something. He didn't know what. He didn't know how it was possible. He didn't know why a child he had never consciously met would carry a memory that pointed to him. But the longer he sat at the table, the more clearly he understood that dismissing it would be the easy choice and not the right one. He thought about the pendant. He had never, in all the years he had worn it, known its origin with certainty. It had come to him during a period of transition, after an accident that had cost him several weeks of clear memory. He had assumed it was his own, had never questioned that assumption. Because why would he? It had been in his jacket. It had felt like his. Now he was not sure. He pulled it off the cord and held it under the kitchen light. Hexagonal. Worn smooth on the edges. On the back, barely legible, a single letter pressed into the metal, not a J. He turned it over in his fingers for a long time. By midnight, he had made a decision. He knew it carried risk. He understood that Charlotte Sinclair had the resources and the inclination to have him removed from the contractor's roster entirely. He understood that showing up again would look, from the outside, like exactly the kind of behavior she had suspected him of. But the girl's face sat in his mind, clear and still, and he had been a father long enough to know that some things were worth the risk of looking wrong. He would go back. He returned the following morning on a pretext, a secondary work order for the basement utility corridor, legitimate enough to get him through the service entrance. He did not go to the 4th floor. He went instead to the administrative wing on the ground level, where the facilities manager kept records going back several years, and where the staff were accustomed to contractors moving through with clipboards and purposeful expressions. James was good at moving with purpose. No one stopped him. He was not looking for anything specific. He was looking for a gap, the kind of inconsistency that a careful person creates when trying to make something disappear. The most revealing thing about any complex system was not what it contained but what it was missing. He found it in the patient intake archive. Ava Bennett, age 6, admitted 7 months ago for a respiratory complication, discharged after 4 days. Mother listed as Charlotte Sinclair, occupation, executive. Father listed as Nathaniel Brooks, status, deceased. The date of death printed neatly in the column a Tuesday, in late October, 3 years prior. Cause, motor vehicle accident. James read it twice. The timeline was clean. Too clean, in the way that things are clean when someone has been careful. Nathaniel Brooks had died 3 years ago, which meant Ava would have been approximately 3 years old at the time. Old enough to carry a sensory memory, but young enough for it to exist as something pre-verbal, a smell, a texture, a feeling of safety rather than a face or a name. But Ava had said, "My real dad." Not my dad who died. Not someone who used to hold me. She had used the present tense weight of that phrase, real, in a way that suggested the distinction still mattered to her. A difference between what she had been told and what she remembered. He looked at the death record more carefully. Nathaniel Brooks, 34 at the time of death. The accident had occurred on Route 9, westbound, at approximately 2 in the morning. A single vehicle collision. The report had been filed through the county coroner's office. James had been in an accident on Route 9. The date was the same. He stood very still in the archive room, the fluorescent light indifferent above him. His memory of that night was fragmentary, had always been attributed to the concussion he sustained when his truck left the road. He had woken in a different hospital 4 days later with bruised ribs, a repaired laceration across his left shoulder, and a gap in his memory that the doctors said might never fully close. He had been alone on that road. That was what he had always believed. The record in front of him suggested otherwise. He photographed it with his phone, hands steady, and walked out the way he had come in. She found him before he found her. He had been crossing the main lobby on his way out when he heard his name, not his first name, but his last, spoken with the precision of someone who had done their research since yesterday. "Mr. Carter." He turned. Charlotte Sinclair was standing near the reception desk. Her expression settled into something harder and more deliberate than the shock and suspicion of the day before. She had been waiting for him. "You're not here for any basement work order," she said. "The facilities manager told me no such order was filed." James met her eyes. "You checked?" "Of course I checked." He nodded slowly. There was no point in constructing an alternative explanation, and he was not interested in insulting her intelligence. "I came back because I found something I couldn't stop thinking about." "You came back to a private medical facility without authorization because you couldn't stop thinking about my daughter." Her voice was even, but the evenness was the product of enormous control. "Do you understand how that sounds?" "I understand exactly how it sounds," he said. "I also understand that your daughter was not confused yesterday. She was not performing. She was responding to something specific. You know that. The physician behind you knew that. You just don't want to know what it means." Charlotte's jaw shifted slightly. "I'm not here to threaten anything," James continued. "I'm not interested in your position or your hospital. I'm telling you that I found a record suggesting your husband and I were on the same road on the same night, that I was carrying something in my jacket that belonged to him, and that your daughter recognized it. Those facts exist whether or not you want them to." Charlotte did not speak for a long moment. The lobby moved around them, orderlies with carts, visitors consulting the directory. The indifferent routines of an institution that does not pause for anything less than emergency. She looked at him with the particular expression of someone encountering a problem they cannot categorize cleanly, cannot assign to a familiar framework. "You have no idea what you're walking into," she said finally. "I'm not walking into anything," James said. "I'm trying to understand what I was already part of, 3 years ago, without knowing it." Something in her expression shifted not toward trust, exactly, but away from the hardest edge of her resistance. The crack was small, barely visible, but it was there. "Ava asked about you this morning," she said. Her voice was quieter. "Before I even came downstairs. She asked if the man from yesterday was coming back." James said nothing. "She hasn't asked about a person like that in 3 years, Charlotte said. The lobby moved around them. Neither of them moved. "Your daughter is not confused," James said again, more gently this time. "She's remembering." Charlotte Sinclair looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time, she did not order him to leave. They did not speak again in the lobby. Charlotte turned and walked away, and James watched her go and made no attempt to follow. But she called his contractor company the next afternoon and asked for him by name. The call was routed to his cell phone. Charlotte did not explain how she had obtained the number. She said only that she wanted to meet somewhere neutral, away from the hospital, and that she would understand if he said no. He did not say no. They met at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the hospital, at a table near the back. Charlotte arrived precisely on time. She was dressed differently, no blazer, no tablet, the professional armor left somewhere else. She looked younger without it, and more exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that comes not from work, but from the sustained effort of holding something heavy for too long. She set a folder on the table. Inside were printed documents, public records, mostly, supplemented with materials she had clearly gathered herself. James looked through them without speaking. Nathaniel Brooks had been an environmental systems consultant, a specific, technical specialty that sat at the intersection of engineering and regulatory compliance. His firm had contracted with several large institutions in the region, including, 3 years before his death, a hospital systems integration project that had involved, among other contractors, the maintenance company James had worked for at the time. James had been assigned to that project for 8 weeks. He had never met a Nathaniel Brooks. Directly he worked primarily in the mechanical rooms, interfacing with engineering documentation rather than the consultants. But the records were clear. They had occupied the same project space, had likely passed each other in the same corridors that autumn. "He talked about you," Charlotte said. James looked up. "Not by name. He came home one evening and said there was a maintenance technician on the project who understood the systems better than the engineers who designed them. He wasn't envious about it. Nathaniel wasn't like that. He was genuinely impressed." She was looking at her coffee. "He said the man had a way of being in a room without taking it over. That he noticed things." James was quiet. He said that was the rarest kind of intelligence. The coffee shop made its small sounds around them. James looked again at the records, the project timeline, the date of the accident, the single vehicle incident report that didn't fully account for why a careful man with no history of reckless driving had left the road alone in the middle of the night. "There was something else on that road," James said. "I've always known it, but I didn't remember what." Charlotte reached into the folder and produced one more document, a supplemental accident investigation summary, privately commissioned, never shared with anyone. James read it slowly. A second vehicle had been present at the scene. Its involvement was inconclusive. The physical evidence was degraded by the time investigators arrived, but the summary noted tire tracks consistent with a second car that had departed before emergency services arrived. The investigation had been closed without resolution. James set the paper down. "He gave me the pendant," James said. "It wasn't a question." Charlotte nodded once. Very slightly. "I think he must have," she said. "I just don't know how. Or how much time there was." Neither of them spoke for a while. "How did you know to keep it?" she asked. "I didn't," James said. "I just couldn't make myself take it off." The full picture took several more days to assemble, coming together not in a single revelation but the way old, complicated truths tend to surface gradually, reluctantly, each piece releasing only when the one before it had been fully accepted. The accident had occurred at 2:17 in the morning. Nathaniel Brooks had been driving west on Route 9, returning from a late consultation 40 miles from home. James had been driving the same road in the opposite direction, heading back from a site visit that had run long. The roads were 2-lane and unlit past a certain point, and the weather that night had been clear, but cold black ice where the temperature had dropped fastest, invisible until the moment it wasn't. Nathaniel's car had gone off the road first. James, coming the other way, had seen the lights at an angle that shouldn't have been possible, had braked and swerved and gone into the embankment himself. The concussion came from the impact, a hard lateral collision that cracked the windshield and did something to his temporal lobe that the doctors charted carefully, and then, as time passed, stopped worrying about. What it had done was remove from him everything that came after the moment he saw the lights, and before the moment he woke in the hospital. Everything in between was gone, but someone had been there. Someone had moved through that gap, had acted, had made decisions that the recovered evidence now suggested were not the decisions of a man who had simply been in a crash. His jacket had been found in Nathaniel's car. That was the detail the private investigation summary had recorded without explanation, a gray work jacket found folded across the back seat, with tools and a contractor's card in the pocket. The card had belonged to James. The jacket had been assumed to belong to the vehicle's occupant, photographed and logged, and then, because no one had known to look for it, passed out of official notice. James must have climbed out of his vehicle, must have crossed the road, disoriented and bleeding, and reached the other car, must have found Nathaniel Brooks alive, or nearly so. The evidence would not support finer reconstruction, but it supported that much. And Nathaniel's daughter had been in the back seat. Charlotte had told him that part quietly, in the same measured voice she used for everything difficult. Ava had been with her father that night in unusual circumstance, the result of a cancelled overnight trip that had brought Nathaniel home early by a route Charlotte hadn't known he was taking. Ava had been asleep in her car seat. She had not been injured. She had been found, when emergency services arrived, calm and dry and apparently fine, covered with a gray work jacket and smelling, as the EMT's report noted with the slightly mystified tone of a professional encountering the inexplicable, faintly of machine oil and cedar. James had wrapped her up, had covered her, and he believed this now with the clarity of something finally settling into place, had held her for some period of time before the shock and the cold had caught up with him, and he had lost consciousness. He had been the last thing she was conscious of before she was carried away. The smell of him, the weight of him, the specific quality of safety he carried without knowing it. All of it had been laid down in her memory at the deepest possible level. Not as a face, not as a name. As a feeling she had spent 3 years waiting to encounter again. She wasn't confused, James said. He had said it before, but now it meant something different. Charlotte looked at him across the table. Her eyes were bright with something she was not yet ready to call what it was. No, she said. She wasn't. Ava met him for the 3rd time in the hospital's small garden courtyard, a paved square with wooden benches and a planter of winter flowers that someone tended with more optimism than the season warranted. Charlotte had arranged it carefully, with the specificity of a woman who understood that important things required proper conditions. Ava came down the corridor holding her mother's hand, dressed in her own clothes rather than a hospital gown. She was being discharged. That afternoon her respiratory issue had resolved, and Charlotte had decided she was better at home. The courtyard meeting was not something the hospital had arranged. It was something Charlotte had decided. Ava saw James and let go of her mother's hand and walked toward him, but she did not run. She was more deliberate than she had been the first time, moving with the careful gravity of a child who has been thinking about something for several days and has arrived at a position. She stopped in front of him and looked up. "Mama said you were there," she said. "When Daddy's car broke." James crouched down so he was at her level. "Yes," he said. "I was there. You kept me warm. I did my best." She considered this for a moment, turning it over with the thorough patience that very young children bring to things they consider important. "I thought I made it up," she said. "The smell, and the warm. I thought it was just something I remembered wrong." She paused. "Mama says I didn't make it up." "You didn't make it up," James said. "Are you going to go away again?" He looked at Charlotte, standing 10 feet away on the path, watching them with the expression of someone who has held something very carefully for a very long time and is beginning, slowly, to set it down. "I'm not replacing anyone," he said, both to Ava and to the space between himself and Charlotte. "I'm not your daddy. He was your daddy. I have no interest in taking that from you." Ava nodded seriously. "I know," she said. "You smell different now, anyway." He smelled more like rain. James laughed a short, real laugh that surprised him. "But you still smell safe," she said. The precision of it, delivered with no self-consciousness at all. The way children say the truest things. He didn't answer that. He didn't need to. Behind her, Charlotte made a small, involuntary sound, not quite crying, not quite not. She turned slightly away and brought one hand to her mouth for a moment, and James did not look at her directly, giving her the privacy of the angle. Ava did not notice. She had already moved on to examining the winter flowers in the planter, her attention shifting with the quick fluency of the very young. The courtyard held all 3 of them in its winter quiet. James stood slowly, and he and Charlotte stood side by side at the edge of the bench, not quite touching, watching Ava crouch over a purple flower and debate with herself whether to pick it. "Thank you," Charlotte said. Her voice was different. Something in it had been put down and had not been picked back up. James said nothing. He watched Ava's small hand hover over the flower and then withdraw, having decided, apparently, to leave it where it was. In the weeks that followed, nothing was announced and nothing was decided. There were no declarations, No formal arrangements, no language applied to what was developing. James continued his work. Lily continued at school. Charlotte returned to her company and the rhythms that had carried her through the past 3 years, though she carried them differently, now less like armor and more like habit, which is what armor becomes when you no longer need it the same way. Ava asked about James on the second day after discharge, and the third, and the fourth. Charlotte answered honestly. He was a person they knew, someone who had helped them, and yes, she thought they would see him again. That was enough for Ava. She was 6. The future was a concept she engaged with in terms of days and meals, and specific anticipated pleasures. And knowing that something good was coming back was sufficient. He came for the first time on a Saturday afternoon in November, when the light was low and amber, and the neighborhood had the particular weekend stillness of a place where people were, for once, mostly at home. He brought Lily. Charlotte had suggested it gently, in the matter-of-fact tone she adopted when proposing something vulnerable that she had decided was right. The 2 girls played in the backyard, while Charlotte made coffee, and James stood in the kitchen doorway watching them, and not talking. And the silence was easy in the way that silence is only easy between people who have been through something together. He came back the week after that. And the week after. He and Charlotte were not simple with each other, they were careful and direct in equal measure. And there were conversations that were hard, and moments when the history between them pressed against the present with the weight of everything unresolved, but they were honest. And honesty, James had found, was more durable than comfort. Ava, for her part, absorbed all of it with the serene practicality of a child whose understanding of the world is still largely sensory. She did not call James daddy. She did not apply any word to what he was. Words were for categories, and he did not fit neatly into any of the categories she had been taught. One afternoon in December, when the 4 of them had been out walking and the cold had sent them back inside in a cluster of coats and noise, Ava took James's hand, and Lily's hand, and Charlotte's hand, and stood in the entryway like a small person who has arranged something and is surveying the result. "This is good," she said. No one laughed and no one cried, though both might have been appropriate. Later, Charlotte asked her what she had meant. Ava considered the question with the patience she reserved for things she found obvious. "You know," she said. "Home." She looked at her mother with the clear, unembarrassed certainty of a child who has learned that the things you feel most deeply are the things that need the fewest words. "He feels like home." Charlotte did not respond right away. She simply held her daughter's face in her hands for a moment, and her eyes were very bright, and the house was quiet around them. She did not tell James what Ava had said. Some things were better left where they landed.